Next section. Introduction. Possibility. The purpose of this book is to describe the agenda of medicine as a social institution, and to describe how the individual medical decision emerges to serve it. Our ultimate goal is to empower medicine by returning it to its humanistic foundation, both in its bedside practice and its broader anthropologic role and responsibility. As our argument develops, it will entail describing the human condition, the existential context of medical practice, as open-ended possibility, and describing the objective medical decision as a creative response to the subjective perception of human possibility. This overall ontological framework for the medical ethic, thus called possibility theory, will portray the social agenda of medicine as the actualization of human possibility. Over the years, I have come to appreciate writers who state their conclusions at the beginning, rather than concealing them until the end. This initial disclosure, though it might leave the author somewhat exposed, nevertheless serves to tether the mind of the reader to expectations, thus easing the ensuing journey. Toward this end, I have introduced 6 conclusions below, developed in the course of this book, along with their corollary notions, and selected here because they create an initial guiding narrative. 1. The brain is the source of consciousness. All of our observations, experimental, clinical, and pedestrian, point to this material foundation. A reliable correlation is observed between accidental or intentional abruption of brain matter and an alteration of behavior or of subjective awareness. Even if consciousness is an emerging feature of the cosmos, separate from the brain, it nevertheless requires the brain for its emergence. The problem with moving from this observation to creating a science of consciousness, and that has been called the hard problem of consciousness by David Chalmers, is the difference between the experience of a material world, on the one hand, and the experience of experiencing a material world, on the other, that is, the awareness of awareness, or of consciousness itself. This difference in kind of experience has suggested to some the existence of distinct fundamental substances for each experience, mind versus matter. It is this difference in kind that blocks a theoretical formulation of a causal link, from its beginning to the end. This results in what has been called the explanatory gap in the parlance of modern science. Normally, modern science would seek to reduce consciousness, as it does for all objects of investigation, to a series of material links in causation, progressing in this case from initial physical loci or processes in the brain to a final targeted conscious event. But this final targeted event, by definition, is measurable only subjectively. It has its existence only in the mind. Thus, this final causal link is impossible to construct in material terms. Additionally, coming at this hard problem from a different angle, if objective links are products of consciousness, that is, if consciousness is a pre-objective field that is the source of objects in the mind, then it would be paradoxical and impossible to reduce consciousness to them, to its own products. It is true that correlations between regions of the brain and specific features of consciousness, called the correlates of consciousness, by researchers such as Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, have utilitarian value for medical research and clinical management. But a science of material causality of consciousness itself, from a material beginning to a targeted subjective end, remains out of reach, possibly awaiting a reassessment of the role and nature of material vis-à-vis the mind, possibly a material theory of the origin of material formulation itself, that thereby acknowledges a self-referential limitation. 2. The brain, though necessary for consciousness, is not the sufficient, insular source of consciousness. In that the brain is an evolved constituent of the universe, and that the content of consciousness, the things we think about, are features of the universe, the brain is just that organ through which the universe has come to know itself. A good analogy for the brain, then, is the transistor radio. The radio is necessary for creating the sound that is emitted from it. The sound, as sound, does not exist without the function of the radio. But the radio is not sufficient for the production of sound. The radio serves as a conduit through which electromagnetic waves are reconstituted as sound. Similarly, the brain has evolved as a conduit of sorts, through which the universe, possibly in the form of cosmic waves or of quantum events, is reconstituted as the subjective experience of cosmic self-knowing. This appears as individual consciousness, and it takes the form, in the theatre of the mind, of an objective world set apart from a subjective knower. Thus, these two apparent substances, matter and mind, are in fact manifestations of a common source, now bifurcated into two interactive features in the mind. The objective world and the subjective knower. Each is an aspect of the one universe, the one requiring the other for its existence in the constituted theatre of the mind. An organic connection between brain and cosmos is necessary for the emergence of consciousness. Just as the chlorophyll-containing leaves of a plant absorb the sun at a quantum level to convert sunlight into sugar, so, the brain has evolved to conjoin with, or to take in, the cosmos at some fundamental level for the emergence of consciousness. Therefore, consciousness is not a mere product of insular calculation that can be reproduced by another calculator substrate. It is the artifact of an organ evolved to conjoin with the cosmos as a conduit. A machine can do this if designed to so conjoin with the universe, but thus far the only such machine is the evolved brain. The substance of consciousness, therefore, is not the physical material of the brain, and it will not be found by looking therein at grey matter. The substance of consciousness is the cosmos itself, manifesting through the agency of the brain, and in the limited anthropic way that the brain makes possible. 3. What we call the material or physical does not represent the limits of reality, but the limits of knowing of reality through the evolved brain. Even our observation of the physical brain itself is a reconstitution by the brain for our consciousness. As Bertrand Russell said, what the physiologist sees when he examines a brain is in the physiologist, not in the brain he is examining. This does not mean that what appears as matter is actually mental. We are not here proposing an idealistic ontology. It means simply that the notion of mind versus matter, or of an internal versus external world, are mythologic constructs, fabricated to accommodate a bifurcated reconstitution of the cosmos by the brain. It just makes practical sense that the brain, being always incompletely evolved, manifests such limits in reconstituting what we perceive as the world. As Arthur Eddington said, it would be unreasonable to limit our thought of nature to what can be comprised in sense pictures. As a corollary, in consciousness, we are aware of a pre-objective background domain, of which the object and the knower are manifestations. There is something behind the veil, as it were, that we know to be the source of what we call self and world. This is the domain that we herein have identified as infinite possibility. The imperfect apposition of an evolved mind with the infinite background world that it intends manifests, for instance, when the rubric of interactive molecules of molecular biology requires additional positing of an epigenome, or when an attempt to grasp the cosmos as objects, in the form of particles or waves, results in a measurement problem, wherein the object itself is said to change with observation, the collapse of the wave, when, in fact, any object, as such, is insufficient to grasp a cosmos that must consist of object and subject, unified. 4. Objective knowledge is a product of the creative response to subjective perception of possibility. What we call objective knowledge comes into being through the projection of metaphor onto perceived possibility, to grasp it as an object for the subject in mind, so that through the resulting subject-object interaction, intended possibility is actualized. This is the origin and the goal of objective knowledge. The interactive process is experienced as the myth of objective science, wherein objective formulations, though created, appear discovered as given. The illusion of a created object as given induces the subject-object interaction, whereby possibility, in which both subject and object partake, is actualized. This mythologic perspective permits a unification of mystical insight with the scientific agenda. When we recognize the steps through which objective knowledge emerges from subjective perception of possibility, their interdependent connection becomes clear. The mystical perception of possibility is no longer mysterious, but is recognized as part of the natural process of knowing. From this, one then can argue that the presence of the possibility-seeing physician at the patient's bedside is just as necessary for a medical decision as is an objective test result. For it is perception of human possibility that determines what test result will be called disease, indeed for what will be called a test. That which we call natural in the natural sciences is preferred to the mystical, not because it is a guarantor of truth, but because it is a guarantor of responsibility for our decisions, by making the elements of our decision explicit. But the mystical insight, being perception of possibility, also as necessary to bring form and substance to the objective medical decision. Thus, the study of the language of medicine is the study of a myth, whose basic form in every era is health versus illness. By grasping human possibility in the negative, as illness, as it is formulated in terms of the pathophysiology of an era, the mind is directed to its actualization as health, formulated in these same terms, serving as the tools of actualization. Thus, the structure and function of the myth remains constant over time, even as paradigms of pathophysiology change. To call a language system a myth is not to make a judgment regarding its truth or falsity, but to focus on its utility for the user. In our case, this utility lies in the grasp and actualization of human possibility. The terms that accomplish this are the terms of discovery. Discovery is that moment when the art and the science of medicine come together. That is, it occurs when the creative metaphorical grasp of possibility as an object is experienced as finding this object as given. Herein, the terms of discovery serve as myth. For instance, the challenge to discover prompts a creative grasp of possibility as an object. The extended language of discovery serves to further execute this process. For instance, the notion of discovery implicates a domain of reality, as a reified repository wherein objects that will be discovered are said to pre-exist. Objects are said to be discovered in reality. The reality myth functions in his way. The nature of reality itself is defined ahead of time, in ad hoc terms, so that objects formulated as found therein take on these same characteristics. Thus, when Bertrand Russell asks, "How do we know about the physical world?" he is begging the question of a physical reality, in terms of which objects of the world will be discovered. This myth of discovery, as it is not aware of itself as myth, does not acknowledge the ground in possibility that it serves. Therefore, for instance, this ground of possibility remains invisible to the theory of evolution, even as stochasticity is the driving mechanism whereby cosmic possibility comes into being. The neo-Darwinian myth describes this manifestation into actuality as the result of the conditions of competition. As these conditions are formulated as discovered, as given, their mythological role in the grasp of possibility is obscured. Thus, that which comes into being is presumed to be meaningless by virtue of a random ground of competition, but it is the ground of possibility that gives meaning to emerging actuality. For all that is actual only because it is possible. It is the infinite domain of possibility, not perspectival competition, that determines the structure of actuality. 5. Perception of possibility is the fundamental level of consciousness. To restate this in a way that is more consistent with our developing theory, perception of possibility is the mode in which the universe first is aware of itself through the agency of the evolved brain. Perception of possibility distinguishes human from machine learning, for a machine, as machine, cannot perceive the cosmic domain of open-ended possibility. Of course, the term possibility is a metaphor, and, as with all metaphors, it serves an anthropic end. In this instance, it emerges to accommodate the fact that the cosmos first is perceived as a predicate to its own actualization. Thus, we say that the cosmos is perceived as a domain of possibility. As Schopenhauer said, in retort to Leibniz's assertion that the actual world is the best of all possible worlds, if God created the world, then he created possibility. The cosmos first perceives its own nature, through the agency of the evolved brain, as a domain of possibility. Thus, we speak of the fundamental laws of nature as underlying all that is, or that might be, actual. We argue that a proposition might be true, or cannot be true, based upon whether we perceive it to be possible. We assess scientific theory based on possible outcome. We acknowledge truth in the beatitudes of Jesus, because we recognize the possibility affirmed therein, regardless of their actuality in the present. That is, we perceive the universe fundamentally as a domain of possibility. This sets the stage to describe the human condition in terms of open-ended possibility, and to see theory as serving this end. Thus, for example, empathy, conceived of as perception of possibility in the other, is fundamental to the medical decision. The medical decision is the fashioning of objective terms of pathophysiology for the grasp and actualization of human possibility. This is the agenda of the individual medical decision, and so of medicine as a social institution, of which the medical decision is an instance and a paradigm. The technical work of this monograph lies in describing the creative steps through which an objective theory arises from subjective impression of possibility. This is necessary in order to demonstrate that objective theory is an artifact, a product, of subjective impression, and thereby to rescue medicine from the illusion that the objective medical decision is the given end in itself. 6. The essence of the human self is its emergence in consciousness as the universe in its act of self-knowing. Therein, open-ended possibility defines the human condition. Coming to grips with this is the human dilemma. Thus, there is no foundation of physical or social law other than its utility in the grasp and actualization of possibility. There is no moral foundation other than responsibility for what is actualized. What we call the experience of beauty is the recognition of possibility manifesting as actuality. This is why a mathematical formula can be said to be beautiful. What we call art is evocation of possibility for its own sake, for the viewer. As perception of possibility, consciousness is its own vindication, for it is the self in the act of attending to that for which it has come into being. What we call the other is recognition of the universe manifesting as self-knowing. Thus, when we engage with the other, we are engaging the universe. This is why engagement with the other always has moral significance and formative ramification for the knower. Altruism is self-interest, not because it comes around also to help us in the end or as an artifact of natural selection at a community scale, but because perception of the other is a predicate to becoming fully human. We are less human if we do not do this. This is Aristotle's assertion that the good is simply that which a good, that is well-formed human does. Perception of possibility thus creates the agenda of medicine, the foundation of medical ethics, and the creative origin of medical science. The postmodern philosophers of the 20th century mistook the significance of material reductionism to proclaim the death of the self. This imagined locus of thought was presumed to be a phantom, an illusion of a material brain, not an emergent real being that stands independently as a source of human value. But, as the brain creates the conditions of cosmic self-awareness, the self is simply the brain's perception of this instantiation of cosmic self-awareness. So, the self has existence, even if fleeting with the brain, no less than does the eternal universe that it manifests. In this, its substance is rightly perceived to be eternal. As Spinoza said, if we pay attention to the common opinion of men, we shall see that they are conscious of the eternity of their minds, but they confuse eternity with duration. Eternity, as it is perceived in ourselves and in the other, is the focus of the practice of medicine. It is participation in the infinite domain of possibility, as it manifests as humanity. This is what we grieve, in illness and in death, as it is what we love, as ourselves and in the other. Anything that interferes with this is made into disease, for its address at the hand of the medical decision. In this also is the agenda of medicine as a social institution. End of introduction.